At first, it looked like an ordinary month in the American prison system until the executions began. One by one, men who had spent years, sometimes decades, waiting on death row were brought into brightly lit chambers where time finally ran out. February 25 would become one of the most chilling months in recent U.S. execution history, filled with final meals, final breaths, and final words that revealed more humanity and more horror than anyone expected. What you're about to hear isn't the polished version found in court documents. These are the hidden layers, the unfiltered moments before death, the forgotten evidence, the contradictions, the apologies, and the last flickers of life that faded inside rooms most people will never see. This is the story of every prisoner executed in the United States during February 2025. Their crimes, their final hours, their last words. 1. The Bowman Execution. South Carolina's long shadow. It began with Marion Bowman, whose story had haunted South Carolina for nearly a quarter of a century. The crime was brutal. A young woman named Candy Louise Martin, shot and left to burn, her final moments swallowed by a dark stretch of woods in 2001. But the part nobody talks about is how messy the case actually was. Missing evidence, a weapon recovered from a river, a cousin who testified under a cloud of doubt, and Bowman insisting for decades that investigators had buried the truth. On January 31, 2025, after years of appeals, Bowman was finally brought into South Carolina's execution chamber. The fluorescent lights reflected softly off the IV tubes as he looked once at his attorney, once at the ceiling, and then closed his eyes for the last time. His final meal was almost childlike. Fried seafood, wings, chicken strips, onion rings, banana pudding, German chocolate cake, and cranberry pineapple juice. A strange comfort before the end. And his last words? A quiet reflection, stripped of anger. Death row inmates may be labeled the worst, but we've all changed since the moment that cost us everything. If my death brings her family any relief, then maybe it will have served some purpose. The room stayed silent long after he was gone, but February was just beginning. Just days later, Texas prepared to execute Stephen Linnell Nelson, a man whose life had spiraled into violence at the age of 24. In 2011, he had walked into a church expecting a simple robbery. What followed was a crime so savage that even veteran detectives paused. The beating and strangling of Reverend Clint Dobson, and the near-fatal attack on Judy Elliott, who survived only after a long battle through surgeries and recovery. But what the public rarely learned was how Nelson spent the final years on death row, writing long letters to churches, apologizing for desecrating a place of worship. Letters that were never released to the media. Texas doesn't grant last meal requests, so on February 5, 2025, Nelson entered the chamber with nothing but the echo of his own heartbeat and the presence of his wife, Helen Dubois, watching from behind the glass. She had been allowed to bring a white service dog, a rare exception that startled even prison staff. Just before the injection, Nelson whispered repeatedly, "I love you. Enjoy life." As the pentobarbital began its journey, he took one final breath and formed a single word: love. And then he was gone, the monitors falling silent. 3. Frazier and Alabama's new method of death. In Alabama, February's execution was unlike anything the country had seen before. Demetrius Tarrant Frazier wasn't facing lethal injection. He had chosen nitrogen hypoxia, a method so new that even corrections officers were still learning its procedures. Frazier's crimes stretched back to the early 90s, from the murder of Pauline Brown in Alabama to the killing of 14-year-old Crystal Kendrick in Detroit. His confessions had been graphic, cold, and immediate. Yet in the years that followed, he became strangely quiet, almost philosophical, speaking more about regret than reasoning. The night before his execution, he asked for Taco Bell, burritos, and a Mountain Dew. It was a simple request, but his final hours would be anything but ordinary. When the mask was placed over his face, witnesses described a moment of stillness, an eerie, almost cinematic silence. At 6:36 p.m., after the gas displaced every oxygen molecule in his body, he was declared dead. His last words were slow and heavy. "First of all, I want to apologize. What happened should never have happened." It was the fourth execution in Alabama using the new method, but by far the most controversial. Florida's return to the gurney, the Ford execution. In Florida, the execution of James Dennis Ford reopened one of the most disturbing cases in the state's history. Back in 1997, Ford had invited Greg and Kimberly Mallory on what they believed was a friendly fishing trip. Instead, they walked into a nightmare. Greg was shot, then struck with an axe. Kimberly was assaulted and murdered. Their 22-month-old daughter was left alone in a truck for more than 18 hours, alone with the blood of her parents. Yet, what most never knew was that Ford had spent the last decade on death row, writing small paper notes to prison chaplains, often containing only a few words: "I failed them." None of these notes were ever publicly released. On the night of his execution in February, Ford said nothing, not one word, but he left behind a handwritten message: hugs, prayers, love, God bless you all. The witnesses watched in silence as the chemicals moved through his body, ending one of Florida's darkest chapters. 5. Texas again, the Tabler execution. And then came Richard Lee Tabler, a name that had echoed through Texas courtrooms for years. His crimes were bold, calculated, and taunting. In 2004, he murdered nightclub manager Mohammed Ramouni and his friend Zed, luring them with promises of sound equipment. He filmed parts of the crime. Then, 2 days later, he murdered 2 teenage girls he believed were connected to Ramouni's nightclub. But the detail that rarely makes headlines is this: Tabler repeatedly called the police after the murders, sometimes to confess, sometimes to threaten, sometimes simply to prove he was still in control. It was a psychological game that left investigators stunned. On February 13, 2025, Tabler entered the execution chamber at age 46. His last statement was unexpectedly calm. "Not a day goes by that I don't regret my actions. I pray one day you find it in your hearts to forgive me." He was the second man executed in Texas that year, and with that, February's list was complete. Here's the part almost nobody talks about, but the questions they leave behind will continue to echo long after their names fade. Because in the end, the death penalty isn't just about what they did. It's also about what their final moments force us to confront.